My lovely friends, it seems you've returned. I'm so glad that you have, but I'm also concerned. I've been sitting out here all alone, waiting for whatever is lurking nearby to finally come forward. There's something dismal about that feeling. And all of a sudden, here you are, my friends, ready to sit with me and listen to more stories. But I ask myself this question. Whatever it is that's hovering nearby, will it come slithering out of the darkness? Or is it going to sit nearby and listen as well? That idea has my blood chilling and shivers going up and down my spine. Can you imagine the torment that I've been enduring sitting here all alone since we last sat together? And now, my friends, here you are again. I'm scared for you. But perhaps it's better to leave that to your imagination without speaking further on it. After all, we don't know whether we've caught its attention, and if it doesn't know that we're speaking about it, it may leave us alone for now. Why don't you have a seat nearby, my dear friends? We did discuss another trip over to the cozy town of Jefferson, and I do have more stories to share. But first, let's make sure you have your flashlight ready. Do you have your blankets close by so you could snuggle in close for protection? Well then, it looks like we're ready to head back into the shadows. As I mentioned before, there are many haunted locations in Jefferson. I spoke about the Con Hotel with its dark and bloody history, but I also mentioned that there are other hotels that are known to be just as haunted. I'm speaking of the Excelsior and the Jefferson Hotel. Some of the stories that I'm intending to share come from close friends and investigators who've gone on these tours, or they've even stayed in one of the rooms at the hotels. And some of these stories are mine. But before we get into the haunted aspects of both the hotels, let me give you a little bit of backstory and history about them. As you take a walk along the bricks of Austin Street, you'll notice the two-storied white building known as the Excelsior Hotel. This building was constructed in the mid-1800s by the riverboat captain William Perry. Perry was concerned about the safety of his guests, and he wanted a comfortable location for those who traveled the water into Jefferson, without them having to endure the harsher locations that had begun to show up randomly near the water's edge. Perry wanted his building to gleam. He wanted it to be more than a hotel. He wanted it to be a beautiful structure of pride. When he opened the hotel in the 1850s, it immediately became a delight to the upper classes of Jefferson. From the comfortable parapets where people could sit out in the evenings and enjoy the cool air, to the metal latticework chairs that were installed at the front of the building so people could take their respite. Over time, the Excelsior Hotel would have such guests as President Ulysses S. Grant, railroad tycoon Jay Gould, Oscar Wilde, Lady Bird Johnson, and even Steven Spielberg. I'll get to Mr. Spielberg's personal story, but first let me introduce you to some of the well-known ghosts in that building. Many people who stay in the upper rooms often smell perfume along the hallway in the upper area or along the stairs. They even hear the brush of skirts, and many people think this might be Emily. Emily's story is a tragic one, and it's said that her heartbreak still rends the night. Emily lived in the mid-1800s in a nearby town. She was a beautiful and dynamic young woman, and she fell easily in love with a man named Samuel. The two made plans to marry, only to find that both families were firmly against the idea. Samuel and Emily refused to take no for an answer. Before long, a plot emerged for the two to run away in the middle of the night and elope. And so the two fled one hot summer evening with the intent to go to Jefferson. The plan was for them to spend their wedding night there at the Excelsior. They were half of the way to Jefferson when Samuel stopped Emily and told her that he could no longer go through with the plan. He'd had a change of heart. Not only was he unsure whether he truly loved her, but he couldn't let down his family. Not only that, but his mother had an idea of whom she believed he should marry, and Samuel was beginning to agree that perhaps his mother was right. Emily was left in the dark forest alone and bereft, with no other idea of what she should do, and with no desire to return home, she continued on her passage to the Excelsior. Once there, she sat in the very room where she would have been a resplendent bride with the man that she loved. For days she sat in the room and let the grief eat at her until she had gathered that grief around her and climbed onto the roof of the building with the use of the upper railing. As the clock struck midnight, Emily jumped from the roof, letting her sorrow claim her. Even to this day, Emily still lets that grief claim her. People have heard and seen a woman in a flowing white gown floating down the hallway, or she's staring out a window into the distance. People have also felt cool drafts or the touch of an icy hand in the room that Emily is thought to have stayed in. Others have seen dents on the bed or even heard the plaintive weeping of a young woman. The smell of perfume that wafts along the hallway and the stairs is also believed to be Emily looking for Samuel, hoping that he's changed his mind even now. There are also rumors that Jay Gould could be lurking around the hotel in his former room, as well as in the rail car that was moved to Jefferson years after he cursed the town. Gould came to Jefferson with the idea of establishing his railway through Texas and furthering his reach. He was hoping that by doing so, he would also make himself quite a bit more money. The problem was Jefferson already had busy ports and river barges, paddle boats, and a swelling lumber community, and that took up most of the spreading commercial needs, so they turned down Gould's idea quickly. Gould's sour response was to go back to his hotel room at the Excelsior and write in the guest book, "Grass will grow in your streets and bats will roost in your belfries," and then he signed it, The End of Jefferson. Misfortune did eventually strike Jefferson, but it wasn't by Gould's hand. The U.S. Army Corps came in with nitroglycerin in the 1870s, and they destroyed a natural dam that had been created from years of trees, sticks, and stumps. This effectively plummeted the water by at least 10 feet, and when that happened, all those ports began to close up because the barges and paddle boats could no longer make it into Jefferson. You would think that after getting his imagined revenge that Gould would have moved on. However, people still claim that they see him in his hotel room there at the Excelsior. There have been mentions of a heaviness in the room at times, and people even seeing a shadow. There are also mentions of luggage and clothing and other personal objects being thrown off the bed or chair. They've also mentioned odd noises coming from the adjoining bathroom. I've had a friend who has had this experience for herself whenever she stayed there back in 2007. Lori and her son had heard about the Excelsior Hotel being haunted. They were excited to try out the Gould room and do a personal investigation of their own. Shortly after the two checked in, they set up a voice recorder and a video camera, and they began to ask questions. No matter how much they attempted to taunt the spirit in the room, they couldn't get anything to happen. After about an hour of no success, the two decided it was time for them to have lunch, and they chose to leave the voice recorder going while they went out. They also chose to leave quite a few varied objects on the bed spread out in case something might happen while they were gone. They were gone for well over 2 hours, and when they returned, they found everything in a disarray. The suitcase she had left open on the chair had been knocked off, and her belongings had been knocked off the bed as well. When they later listened to the voice recorder, there was a decided male voice, though they couldn't make out what he was saying. There was also a watery churning sound like somebody had been messing with the plumbing. Lori asked at the front desk if anybody had gone in her room, and the front desk assured her that nobody had been in there since they had checked in. Nobody before that she knew of had complained about plumbing issues or hearing a churning watery sound. She did ask around, but nobody came forward with that complaint. But people have said that they've heard the male voice in that room as well. You may have come to recognize that this is the exact same room that Steven Spielberg stayed in the 70s. As the story goes, Spielberg was in the area filming his movie Sugarland Express. After an exhausting day of recording, he and retired ABC newsman Lyndon Adams checked in late over at the Excelsior. As soon as Spielberg got to his room, he set his suitcase in the nearby chair and began to clean up. It wasn't long for his suitcase to be forcefully ejected from the chair. The moment definitely gave the director pause, but he picked his suitcase back up and set it back in the chair. When nothing further happened, he got in bed and fell asleep. What would terrify Mr. Spielberg is when he was woken up in the early hours by a little boy asking if he would like breakfast. The boy who woke him up was a young black child who was dressed in garments from the 1800s. When the boy disappeared, that was more than enough for Spielberg. In an interview, he told a columnist, "I made everybody wake up, pack up, and get back in the cars at about 2 o'clock in the morning. We had to drive 20 miles to the nearest Holiday Inn, and everybody was hot at me. I should add that I am not normally superstitious." Spielberg's personal experience in the Gold Room would later lead to him writing the screenplay for his classic movie Poltergeist. Years later, Lyndon Adams, who had been with Spielberg that night, would have his own experience with his wife Carol. Mr. Adams and his wife stayed in the Gold Room on September the 5th, 1955. Adams said, "After soaking up some history, Carol and I went upstairs. As I unlocked the tall door, for some unexplainable reason, a tune started running through my head, The Gold and Silver Waltz by Franz Lehrer." Later that night, after the two had gone for dinner in the nearby restaurant and come back to bed, the two fell asleep while watching TV. Adams said that he had woken to go to the bathroom and noticed that the door was starting to open slowly. He shut it and latched it firmly, and whenever he returned to the door afterward, he found he couldn't turn the knob. Something or someone was apparently gripping the knob on the other side. Adams called out to his wife, "Come on, Carol, very funny." The pressure let up, and the knob turned easily. He said, "I flicked off the light as I opened the door. Across the room, standing beside the bed, was the figure of a woman dressed in all black, with a black veil. For one split second, I thought it was Carol, but she was in bed wearing a white nightie. The apparition vanished." Shortly after her disappearance, Adams said he was aware of a scent of perfume in the room. He stood there slightly shaken, and when he got in the bed, he thought of waking his wife, but was worried that she would be frightened and want to leave. The next morning, Adams would be woken to the aroma of cigar smoke and hear what sounded like somebody rifling through newspaper pages. When he lifted his head, Adams said he didn't see anything, but the sound of the newspapers stopped shortly after. But a knocking sound soon came from the headboard near his head, and then the dragging of fingernails. Adams was tempted to wake his wife, but chose not to since it was still very early in the morning. When his wife did wake up, she asked if he was having trouble sleeping, and he admitted to having a vivid dream about a woman in black seated at a grand piano playing the Gold and Silver Waltz. Later that next evening, when the two were returning from dinner, they glanced into the huge parlor off the main lobby and noticed a black grand piano very similar to the one that Adams had dreamt about the night before. That second night, Adams was woken again to noises in the bathroom. He said, "I heard the toilet flush. I reached over. Carol was still beside me. That's when the knocking resumed, this time very persistent." Though he struggled to fall asleep, Adams didn't tell his wife anything about the paranormal experiences that he was having. However, Carol would later proclaim that she remembered hearing the knocking sounds herself. As a friend once suggested, staying in a haunted hotel room and hoping for a restful night is far from the wisest idea. If you're hoping for more restful spirits over at the Jefferson Hotel, I can assure you now that they are far from it. The Jefferson Hotel is likely the greatest favorite of many paranormal investigators, and there's many a reason why. Not only do the owners know that it's haunted, but they celebrate the spirits that are in this place. You can even go to the website historicjefferson.com, and there is a link to the ghosts and the history of the building. Before we actually start describing and discussing the ghosts that reside in that building, I would actually like to describe and discuss some of that building's history because it does explain why it is as haunted as it is. You see, the Jefferson Hotel actually began as a cotton warehouse. It was built in 1861 by Alan Urquhart, who was one of the two founders of Jefferson. He was a professional land surveyor and a ferry owner, and he had the foresight to recognize the potential of the area. He helped to found the commercial part of Jefferson, and he's also part of the reason why one section of the city actually has streets completely opposite of what the residential area has. At the time that Urquhart built the warehouse, the cotton industry was thriving in the area. As I said before, they began construction on the building in 1851, and at that time, child labor was heavily used. From that sentence alone, you can likely guess what I'm hinting at, and yes, this will be mentioned later on. As the cotton industry lost steam, pun intended, and the logging and steamboat industry took over in the area, Urquhart decided it was time to sell the building. From his hands, it not only began to change names, but owners at a rapid pace. In 1868, they briefly settled on the name The Fireproof House, even though the walls were covered heavily with newspapers. Not so ironically enough, a fire broke out in 1869 on Dallas Street, and of course, the building caught fire as well. It took a substantial amount of damage, but the owner decided to rebuild on it and then sell it. From there, it became a saloon and brothel, and then shortly after that, a roaring hotspot known as the Crystal Palace. When it was a saloon, it was pretty common for loose women and prostitutes to hang around the porch to lure men in. When it became the Crystal Palace, suddenly those loose women were being snuck into the back door. Risk takers and lovers alike were eager to attend the Crystal Palace. A man could find or lose his fortune there with a turn of luck in one night. Nearby, lovers would be dancing the night away to ragtime music. In the early 1870s, it was known as the place to go for entertainment. As I mentioned before, there were many a risk taker who would come to the Crystal Palace, which meant that there were probably quite a few deaths that happened as a result. To this day, people still report hearing ragtime music in the empty ballroom area, and whenever there was a restaurant in that building, people would say that there was paranormal activity happening pretty often. It wouldn't actually become a hotel until 1874 when it was named the Pruitt House. It would maintain as a hotel until 1882 when Nancy Grigsby bought the deed to the building and turned it into the Grigsby House. After Nancy Grigsby sold it, it became another brothel, then an old armory hall, and then a warehouse, and then in 1911 it became the Jefferson Hotel for the first time. It repeatedly changed hands and changed names as family after family took the building over. When A.H. Schluter and his wife Ethel took it over, it finally became the new Jefferson Hotel. You're likely getting an idea of why I wanted to touch on its history first. With all the expansive history that it has, is it any wonder that every room in that building is haunted? There are even claims that this is the world's most haunted hotel. Along the first and second floor, it's pretty common to hear children laughing and running around, even when there's no children staying in the hotel. There's a little boy who exists in room 3 who is often staring at the door. It's believed that in the early 1900s, he was actually drowned in a bathtub that was in room 9. He's been seen in that room multiple times, as have the Mill children and young Jenny Brown. The Mill children were actually helping with the construction of the building whenever Urquhart was building his warehouse. With their small demeanor, they were able to get into hard-to-reach places. But construction is a dangerous job, and they had no regulation to protect them at all. The 3 children were casualties in the raising of the building. People now see a young boy around 7 years old in knee-length breeches and a young girl in a pinafore. There's also a small boy with red hair, and all are known to move small objects around and play pranks on the guests. People have complained that lights will flicker, doorknobs will rattle, and their showers will turn on at random on their own. When the kids aren't having fun with the guests, then they're up on the second floor playing with the dolls. People hear their laughter along the rooms and in the hallway as they chase each other around the hotel. The other young spirit with them, Jenny Brown, is a young girl who was caught in a fire when the building was known as the Pride House. People believe this is the young blonde girl who went around to each door to wake guests up whenever the hotel was on fire years ago. On the night in question, many guests claimed they saw the young girl running back and forth to make sure they were all awake. It wasn't until the next day that they realized there were no children staying in the hotel at that time. She and the other children liked to move between rooms 3, 4, 9, 10, and especially 14 where the dolls reside. People have claimed that somebody has breathed in their ear as they're drifting off to sleep, or that somebody has lifted the covers. It's believed that this is Jenny having a little bit of fun with them. The children are playful and mischievous, and clearly they mean no harm to anybody who stays in any of the rooms. And while people have noticed them in the upper stairs area, especially in room 14, more people tend to notice the bride. The exact identity of the bride isn't known. There's a chance that she's one of 2 women. It could either be Elizabeth, who stayed there in the late 1800s, or Lydia Grigsby, who was there in 1912. Both women stayed in the hotel on the day of what was supposed to be their wedding, almost 50 years apart from each other. They were both jilted on their wedding day, and it's likely that both were pregnant as well. Not much is known about Elizabeth, but a news piece on Lydia was found. Lydia and her family were staying in the Grigsby house as they prepared for her wedding. On the day it was meant to happen, she had already dressed in her fine white wedding gown and she had piled her golden hair on top of her head. She and her family had already left the hotel and had gone down to the church to wait for her groom. That's where she received his letter that he wasn't coming. In her grief, she returned to her hotel room and hung herself from the 12-foot-tall headboard. She may have taken her life in grief, but people who have encountered her say that she is gentle and sweet, at least for the most part. The bride, who introduced herself as Libby, usually follows the bed where she took her life. The bed's current residence is room 19. People who have stayed in the bed claim that she has tucked them in or even playfully tickled their feet, and she'll move objects around. They've even seen her standing either at the end of the bed in wedding garments or nearby, smiling at them. Her demeanor seems to change whenever her presence is felt in room 13, and it's likely that she took her life in this room. Pictures will fall from the wall at random. People will hear pipes rattling roughly, as if struck by tools, and there are bangs that can be heard in the bathroom. People have even heard splashing noises coming from an empty, dry bathtub. Some have even felt a chill in the bathroom as well. I can personally attest to her presence there in room 13, but we'll discuss that in a little while. Libby isn't the only temperamental spirit that hangs around the area. It's either in room 19 or 17 where a certain mirror hangs. This mirror is known as Judy's mirror. Judy is thought to be the spirit of an anguished young woman or teenage girl who was forced to work in the hotel when it was a saloon and brothel. Though it's not known in which room this may have happened in, it's said that Judy and a client got into a heated altercation. He stabbed her and left her in the bathtub to die. In her final moments, all she could do was stare at the nearby mirror. Guests who stay in this particular room now find that whenever they take a hot shower that fogs up the mirror, have messages left behind from Judy. Sometimes the message is a plea for help or a warning for them to get out. Other times they may see the image of a young woman. It's not known whether her name actually is Judy or whether the young woman is calling for a friend she once knew by that name. And while she is leaving messages that either are pleas for help or warnings for them to leave now, the warnings may be to alert people that there is further danger in the building. One of the most commonly seen spirits in the building isn't actually known. He's only called the Vanishing Man because he tends to come and go as he pleases in different rooms. And while he's never made a threatening move against a guest, he can be persistent. People who describe the Vanishing Man say that he's tall and wears high boots and a long coat. And it may be his voice that people hear in room 0 yelling out "no" at random. If it is him in this room, then he's especially active. People who have stayed in this room have both seen and felt the double beds lift on their own. There have been claims that the ceiling fan would shake as if somebody was hanging onto it and moving it around, and people have even seen shadows from time to time. When the room was being renovated some time ago, gemstones were found under the floor. If this was indeed the Vanishing Man, maybe he was trying to keep others away from his hidden and ill-gotten treasure. It's possible he may be the same spirit that has been in room 2. People have seen a full-bodied apparition in here moving through the bathroom wall, and they will hear disembodied voices of a conversation. Whichever room you may decide to stay in at this hotel, expect that your items may move or disappear, either because of him, the bride, or the children. No one knows exactly who or what is in room 6, but it unnerves people, and there's a good reason why. It's pretty common in this room to hear scratches on the carpet or even on the mattress. Others have seen ghostly residue on the sheets of the bed that slowly dissipates. There are tendencies for objects to be picked up and thrown, or even the furniture to be moved at random. The bathroom doorknob is known to rattle pretty commonly, and people will not only see apparitions in the mirrors, but they will also hear disembodied in footsteps. They also see shadows moving around the room. I had a dear friend stay in room 6 one time. She said that after staying there only one night, she would only suggest that the most stoic and seasoned enthusiast who doesn't scare easily stay in this room. I had actually intended to stay in that very room before my friend told me what she did. After that, I chose my option to the bride's room when the bed was still in room 13. When I was first told about the Jefferson Hotel and the hauntings that happened there, I was more than excited to visit it. I was excited to have a supernatural experience happen there, but I wasn't willing to have it alone. And so with my poor husband in tow, we took a room there and settled down for a night of nothing at first. After a full day of sightseeing and looking through antique shops, we went back early to the room and settled down for a light rest before dinner. While he dozed and I read, I could hear a little bit of sloshing from the bathroom and couldn't figure out what exactly the sound was. When I went to investigate, I didn't see anything to cause alarm. At that time, I didn't know a thing about the bathroom making sounds when nobody was in there. I heard the sounds a couple more times after we returned from dinner later that night. By that time, I was exhausted and ready to fall asleep, but just couldn't get myself to do so. It was a little past 11 when I finally gave up the idea that I was going to drift off on my own and had picked up my book. That's when I heard the first bang from the bathroom. I didn't think anything about it at first until I realized that it sounded more like the pipes were banging against the bathroom wall. After this happened a few more times, that excitement I had felt at the beginning was beginning to turn into agitation. At first, I did my best to ignore the sound, but eventually I turned over and nudged at my husband until he woke up. As soon as he did, I complained that the pipes wouldn't stop banging. His response to this was, "It's probably just old pipes," and then he rolled away from me with the full intent of falling back to sleep. As the night went on, I knew that there was no possible way that the pipes would be banging that often or that loud against the wall as much as it was. At least not without either falling apart or actually coming through the wall. I can't say how long he had been asleep again whenever he turned back and looked at me to say, "Stop messing with my feet." Since my feet were curled up close against my body, I looked at him like he was crazy. I had yet to fall asleep, and his demand for me to leave his feet alone irritated me. I snapped back at him, "I'm not touching your feet." We glared at each other for a second, and then he rolled back away from me and said, "I said stop touching my feet. Leave me alone, I'm trying to go to sleep." I was about to snap back at him whenever I saw the sheets at the end lift on their own and then lower. It was only then that I remembered that sometimes the bride would come into the room to adjust and tuck in sheets, especially of men who were traveling alone. I didn't bother to respond to him. Instead, I adjusted the pillows against the headboard and sat myself up a bit more. About a minute later, there was a dull thump against the headboard between myself and my husband's head. He turned to look at me, and I shook my head at him and said, "That wasn't me." I could tell from the expression on his face that he believed me. I never did get any rest that night. Between the banging in the bathroom and then thinking I saw a shadow moving through the room, I just couldn't sleep. The next morning when we checked out, I asked the young lady who was running the front desk if there had ever been a problem with the pipes in room 13. I could only guess, is there some kind of nighttime construction that's going on close to here? She smiled at both of us, shook her head, and then asked, "Did you hear any banging on the headboard as well?" My husband admitted that aside from the one that both of us had heard, that he had heard a few more near his head. He told the young lady, "Well, I just thought since the bed is old that the headboard would move every time one of us made the slightest movement and it was banging up against the wall." Her answer to that was to smile, shrug, and wish for us to have an enjoyable day. Since my stay, which was well over a decade ago, the hotel briefly closed and then was purchased and reopened by another couple. Not only do they recognize that the hotel is haunted, but they appreciate the spirits there and the history of the place. One of the owners has also put up a video about a certain room that he has adamantly stated nobody is allowed to go to, and with good reason why. One of the spirits that I didn't mention resides up in the attic. He recently did an investigation in there and came back with heartbreaking results. I'm not going to go into detail here because it is a painful realization, but I do suggest that you watch the video and then go to the website for further explanation about the attic. But while you are there on the website, I also suggest that you rent a room and get ready to experience a supernatural evening. Well, my dear friends, it looks like it's getting rather dark, don't you think? It's become late in the evening, and I would say to curl up with your blanket where you are and rest your weary head, but we both know that would be dangerous. All good things must come to an end after all. Even as eager as I am to have you curl up close and listen to what stories I have, we both know it would never be wise to linger out here, not in the shadows. And so, my dear friend, instead, I will bid you a good night, and I do hope that you sleep tight. And as always, don't let the ghouls bite.